Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Preacher Boys podcast. Today, I'm finally sitting down with my friend Chad Harris, who you've probably seen in Shiny Happy People, the #1 documentary series on Amazon Prime for a very long time. And on this episode, we talk a lot about Chad's background. We talk a lot about where Chad is now, and we connect over some similarities in our experiences within fundamentalism. It's a really great conversation. I laughed, I cried, that's an exaggeration, and sat on the edge of my seat the whole time as Chad shared some incredible insights from his perspectives. I'm so glad this episode finally happened, and I hope it's not the last time that I connect with Chad Harris here on the podcast. I'm not going to say anything else. Let's get into the episode. All right, everybody, welcome back to the Preacher Boys podcast for an episode I feel should have happened years ago. Chad Harris, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I mean, honestly, we were talking about this right before we started talking. It feels like we already have, and I'm actually kind of surprised it hasn't yet. But I have heard your voice so much, and you've been such a great advocate for people who have escaped the IFB and everything that, I mean, I kind of feel like I know you already. So it's wonderful to get to talk to you finally.
Yeah, and the feeling is mutual because I've been watching all of your content. It's weird because there's so many people in the advocacy space, or whatever you want to call this space, the culty influencer space, like whatever umbrella you want to put us under, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, umbrella's a little tainted there.
My therapist said that today. They said something like, "You have an umbrella over you," and I was like, "No, let's not do that one."
As long as it's not multi-layered,
right? Is there's multiple umbrellas. Your wife is here. She's no, I'm just kidding. But no, I've seen so much of your content. It's the same way with Lindsay Williams or Alice Gretchen, or like, there's so many people that I just am a fan of and love their work. And in my brain, I'm like, we've connected, we've done things. And then I sit there and go, oh shoot, Chad has never been on the show. So here we are. This is finally happening.
And I am super stoked to get into it. So thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you, man.
I know most podcasts go back to the beginning and they go, tell me about childhood Chad. And I'm sure we'll cover some of that. But I want to know, like, so many people are familiar with your story, especially my audience. They devoured Shiny Happy People. They've listened to you on TikTok. But I don't know if you feel this way, but when Let Us Pray ended, when it first premiered, I had this sense of like, there's closure on a big chapter here. A lot of cool things have happened. There's awareness like never before. And then my immediate thought is, what happens now? Like, what's going on now? And I've heard you echo that sentiment for Shiny Happy People. It's like, well, this program's still here. Like, what happens now? In your mind, day to day, like, how much real estate does all of this take up in your mind? And like, what are you hoping keeps happening as a result of like a Shiny Happy People and the massive exposure that's out there right now?
That is an excellent question that I wish more people asked, frankly, because one of the main disappointments I have about Shiny Happy People and how it's turned out is that, you know, I'm glad that people are aware of what happened with the IBLP, and especially with Let Us Pray, which, God, that was a tough watch, but very much needed. You know, I'm glad that there is awareness out there. But one of my main concerns is that a lot of that awareness has kind of gone to, for lack of a better term, the trauma porn crowd, as it were. You know, there are people who like to see these stories about, you know, cults and the trauma people have been through. And, you know, they kind of get this sense of, oh, wow, you know, I really feel for them and everything, and then go on with their days. And I get it. Like, you know, you can't take up every single cause out there and you can't save the world. But the fact remains that at the end of the day, the IFB for Let Us Pray and the IBLP for Shiny Happy People are still out there, and they're still causing these issues. And I know that there are people out there that have the resources to help where we can't. Now, and I'm not saying this is like a begging thing. You know, understand, I am an educationally neglected, you know, homeschooling cult survivor. I don't have the education or the resources to take on IBLP all by myself. And I will say, thankfully, there have been some people who have stood up and who have offered to help us. And, you know, there are some things happening behind the scenes, especially going up against the IBLP and Bill Gothard that, you know, hopefully we'll hear more of in the future. But I also see this tendency to kind of like say, well, thankfully that never happened to me, and then move on. And I'm like, yeah, but what about the rest of us? And but to flip that around, one of the good things I have heard is so many people who either A, grew up in IBLP and have never told their stories because they didn't think anyone would believe them, or B, people who had IBLP influences in their lives that didn't realize where it came from. They have reached out and they have said, hey, wait a minute, I remember seeing that umbrella diagram, or I remember hearing some of those Children's Institute songs. And they are starting to put the pieces together as to just how much this reached out. And they are interested in helping out. And honestly, that encourages me, but I wish that half of the people who saw Shiny Happy People on Amazon Prime, and I don't have the numbers, but my understanding is it was a huge number of people.
It was their number one documentary, right? Was it documentary or series?
I think it was a documentary series. Yeah, my understanding from what I heard from folks was it was the number one documentary series, and it was number one on Amazon for 3 weeks. So, I wish that half of those people, had an interest in like really taking the fight to IBLP and shutting it down completely. As it stands, IBLP is still out there, and I actually watched them live stream their annual conference back in April, and they're going on as if nothing has happened. Granted, their crowds are a lot smaller, but they're still out there, and I know for a fact that there are still people being hurt by their teachings.
Yeah, that's one of the tricky things is, luckily, I avoided, in terms of the education side, I feel like I got a really good side of the deal for IFB kids. Like, I got to go to private education, and Becca, aside from science and history, is a pretty solid education in many ways. But I feel the same way in terms of just, I look at the scale of things in the IFB, abuses, like financial things, like racial issues going on. And just, there's no one person, no matter how good your education is, that could say, let me solve all these problems. But I can at least see, like you see, or like other people in the documentary see, there are major issues. And all I sit there sometimes and think is like, why hasn't a lawyer jumped on this yet? Or why hasn't a district attorney in this state jumped on this? And my biggest frustration, I think, as a content creator and advocate, or, I don't even like using any of these words because they all sound so played out. But I'm like, how do I get this person to connect to this cause in like a real way and actually do something? And, I'm curious for you, like, you're somebody here who's really fighting for the exposure and the awareness. Like, imagine the right person's listening to this. Like, what do you think the next step is to go, hey, this is like the next domino I see that needs to fall? Like, what would you like to see happen? Is it more exposure? Is it a lawsuit? Is it like what do you see next on the horizon?
I absolutely would love to see actual lawsuits happen. And now that there is, this awareness in the zeitgeist and everything to really push this forward and to get awareness and eyes on the suit itself. I think that, I would love for someone to take up the mantle where things failed with Gothard's direct victims. Like, I know that there are more out there, and I hope that there are people out there who are willing to take on the case. Those of us who, grew up in IBLP typically don't have a lot of resources because we're still catching up on adulting, and especially those who were victimized by Gothard. But I, wish that there were people who could, take up the cases and really look into the abuses that happened. There is currently legal action going on between Bill Gothard and IBLP right now that I wish more people were taking a look at. Bill Gothard is suing to take over IBLP again.
Wow. When did this happen?
This has been ongoing since about 2020. And I have the court documents and everything that have been sent along. But and trust me, getting all that information is a bit of a tooth pulling thing because Illinois state courts are not that great about accessing that sort of thing. But as far as I know, as of earlier this year, it's still ongoing that Bill Gothard is trying to keep IBLP from selling off all their properties. And they are selling off their properties. They recently put up the Northwoods, Michigan retreat property that Bill sent his brother to. They put that up for sale recently. I don't know if it's been bought yet or not. But they are liquidating all their properties, and they're trying to, get rid of as much as possible. And Bill's trying to put a stop to that and come back in, claiming that he legally is still the head of IBLP. And that's going on, and not much has been said about that in the media at all. And so I wish that there were more awareness. I wish that there were more like solid legal actions that could be taken against both Bill Gothard and IBLP. And more than anything, I would like IBLP to shut its doors once and for all. However that happens, whatever it takes to get that to happen. And look, I understand that IBLP is not as powerful as it once was. I understand that, the homeschooling branch is shut down, and slowly but surely they're liquidating their assets and probably doing a end game in the next decade or so. But there are still people being hurt by their teachings in the meantime, and every child that's hurt by them is one child too many. B, it's still getting away with it. Like, I just hope that at some point that, they're held accountable for what they did. It just doesn't sit well with me, the fact that they get to ride off gently into the sunset with millions of dollars that were made on the backs of those of us who supported their ministry, us and our families. And also, I think it sends a message. IBLP was one of the original Christian nationalist organizations that had a broad ranging effect on various forms of government, law enforcement, as we saw in episode 4 of Shiny Happy People. And even though they're small fish now compared to what they were, it's still one of the originals. And I feel like if we get them shut down, it sends a message. I mean, as of when we're recording this right now, Tenet Media just shut down because of the exposure of their ties to Russian organizations. Like, that just happened today or like yesterday. And I feel, and that's sending shockwaves throughout the Christian nationalist media that's currently, promoting all this political stuff that you see going on in the country right now. I feel like IBLP would have the same effect, especially to those old school people like, say, Mike Huckabee, who was very much affiliated with them for years. And the politicians who have courted and supported IBLP for years. Matter of fact, there was a Texas state congressman who spoke at their annual conference back in April. Like, there is still influence happening. And I feel like the more organizations that are called out and are forced to close their doors, the more that, we send the message that, hey, this is no longer tolerated,
This is why you're here, because you just poured so much piping hot tea all over the place. And we're like, this is happening. And even somebody, and this is what is scary to me, is like, I'm in this stuff more than most. And I didn't know about that. And again, IBLP and IFB are, they're different, but there's a lot of crossover. But like, there's things like Bill. Yeah, right. Because you have a foot in both of those pools. Like, but the fact that like there's this internal struggle between Gothard and IBLP, like, I don't know that. And like, I don't think there's many that do. I knew he was ousted by IBLP to protect their own brand and their own image. But like, that's really fascinating. And yeah, you mentioned like, there's a lot now. And I think because of internet exposure, like we are seeing, I mean, Tim Pool literally just got called out big time for, which I could talk about that forever, but like, there's money getting funneled into these organizations, millions of dollars, and people have no idea where it's coming from, the kinds of things they're doing. And I agree very strongly with the fact that like the most frustrating way for ministries to end, in my mind, is where people go 10 years from now and they go, whatever happened to that ministry? Instead of knowing like they got their ass shut down like by this moment in time and it's memorialized. Like, that sends a big warning flare to all other ministries like it. And so I'd hope to see that happen. I am curious, and I want to talk a little bit. I don't really want to go chronologically through your story because I know that's out there and people have heard a lot of it. And I can link to some that give kind of the biography. But I want to kind of just talk to you a little bit about who you are now versus who you were in IBLP, because I think this is really fascinating. You said something on a podcast I was listening to the other day that was heartbreaking, which is you were saying your parents would literally introduce you to people as the kid we spanked the most. And you were asking questions. You were always kind of bucking against the system. I don't think a lot of that's changed, but tell me, like, how much have you evolved from childhood Chad to the Chad you are today? Like, do you feel like it's a complete metamorphosis, or is it just like you've grown more in alignment with who you actually are inside?
I'm still trying to figure that out. I mean, seriously, that's a lot of therapy sessions that we've
Right,
been
right.
through on that one.
Can you summarize
Yeah.
that into about 5 minutes? That'd be great. No, just
Oh God.
yeah.
Or not. No, okay, so yeah, it's true. I mean, I always was viewed as the more difficult child, mostly
Yeah.
because I talked a lot, and because I had a lot of questions, and I tended to
Same
try to
here. Yeah.
push my boundaries a little bit more than the average kid. But this is like I was talking with Lindsay after we had a really big discussion about episode 3 of Shiny Happy People, where that child got pulled on stage and they demonstrated spanking on that child, which was probably the main part of the series. I had to pause and say, I was watching it with Heather Heath and I said, we got to stop here. Then Lindsay called me immediately after that. She was breaking down too. I told her, I said, Lindsay, I said, that's terrible. But also, what that tells me, especially where we're sitting now, is that it didn't work.
Mhm.
Like at the end of the day, they never broke us. That all was intended to break us, to break who we were. And the fact that we are on the other side of it and we are pushing back and we are in this series talking about IBLP proves that we never broke.
Hmm.
Something about who we were survived. We got bent a little bit, yeah. And, we still have to repair those parts of ourselves that were harmed.
Yeah.
But it never fully worked. The idea was to break your child's will and to build them up in the image IBLP and the IFB, in my case as well, wanted them to be. And it just didn't work. Now, at some point, I was really compliant. Sometime in my teenage years and in my young adult years, I found out that life was a bit easier if you play ball. And of course, the idea of adulthood and, all that seemed very daunting. And I'm like, okay, so if you follow the rules, things are okay. But I found out very quickly, especially when I started looking into the higher echelons of the IFB, that the rules only applied to the people on the bottom. The people at the top got to do whatever they wanted. And people got hurt as a result. And that's when I found out that I didn't sign up to hurt people. And that's not what I wanted to do with my life. And so I feel like if I had have been completely broken and then rebuilt in this image, I would have had no qualms about pastors being able to abuse people or people being hurt. I would just accept it as acceptable losses in the ministry and stuff, like collateral damage. It is what it is. The mission is first. But when everything I saw was going against what internally I knew was right, then I felt like that part of me was finally brought to the surface saying, you need to run, you need to live your own life away from all this. And I'm thankful it never broke. I'm thankful. And I'm one of the lucky ones because I know a lot of people who, for whatever reason, never could leave. And they've had varying degrees of how their life has turned out. But in general, I feel like, even though things haven't been easy and I haven't lived like, this wonderful, happy life where nothing has ever been a problem, it's still much more authentic and better than most of the people I've seen who have stayed on the inside.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Well, you got me tearing up 27 minutes in, which is great. But it is like, it's that idea of like they tried to break us and didn't is powerful. And I haven't heard it put that way. Or with my really bad memory that I've discovered in the last year, maybe I've heard that put that way before and I'm hearing it for the first time again. But it's, what do you think it is? And I know nobody has the answer for this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. But I've been asked this a ton of times on shows where people go, why did you see it? Or why did you push back? Because there is two types of kids. And we know, like, right when I say this, you're thinking of these kids. Like, there's the kids, who asked questions. Maybe they weren't straight up. And I don't think I was never straight up rebellious. Like, I just asked questions a lot. And that's not cool in fundamentalism. But like, there's the kids who ask the questions and want to know, like, but why do we do this? Why do we pray this way? Why do we go to this ministry? Why do we do this? And then there's the kids that go, yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. And literally, I mean, that was my family. Like, my brother was very much the yes, sir, yes, ma'am forever. And I was the, but why? Like, what do you think it is inside of some of us that asked the questions and some of us that complied? Like, is it just a personality difference? Is it like what do you think that distinction is?
I think that there were always kids who were curious, and I think that there are always kids who are going to be, focused on the. Uh, they're going to be focused on the. How should we put it? The abstract, or like the reasoning behind things, and asking these questions that, frankly, the tenets of IBLP and the IFB try to push against, and also too. One of the things I've learned in therapy is about the dynamics of dysfunctional families, right? And I think some of it too has to do with the whole golden child scapegoat and all that sort of thing. As the child who was spanked the most, the strong-willed child, I was the scapegoat in the family. My older brother, who had a interest in playing ball, was the golden child, and he followed all the rules, or at least he was assumed to. Myself, I was always assumed to be breaking the rules. And I think a lot of times too, the ones who are the scapegoats tend to have a little bit more of a, because they see inherently that something is off in the balance of this family or in this group. And I have noticed more often than not that those of us who tried the hardest and never could measure up no matter what we did, we are the ones who end up leaving. And another thing too, at least in my case, was I really did really held my dad in high regard, because he was one of those people who initially asked a lot of questions. He grew up charismatic, and he eventually was assured of his eternal security through a Southern Baptist friend, and eventually went to Southern Baptist Seminary, where he left because he questioned the faculty of that Southern Baptist Seminary. It's no longer there. It's Clark College in Mississippi, apparently. And he was recruited from there by one Jack Hiles, who was starting up a school in Hammond, Indiana. So, and then he questioned Jack Hiles because he wanted to preach. He was very much in the end times. My dad wanted to start preaching right away while going to school. Hiles said no. Dad said, well, what if the Holy Spirit tells me? Hiles said, while you're here, I'm the Holy Spirit. And Dad had a problem with this, so he left. So he told me these things growing up, about how he pushed against these quote unquote authorities because he didn't feel like, they were doing what God was telling him to do. Well, years later, when I was under the ministry of a pastor whose wife left and accused him of emotional abuse and sued him for that, in fact, and he ended up being voted back in as pastor to the church I was working for, I asked my dad, why did this happen? And he said, well, sometimes things like this happen, but we don't want to hurt the ministry, so it's best not to talk about it. And that was when I started saying, what changed? Where in your career did you start being okay with people doing things that you clearly believe are against scripture only because they've reached a certain point? And that was where it started breaking down for me, where I stopped from the compliance and I started saying, wait a minute, yeah, the things that you told me so much about you growing up and your early days in the ministry now no longer apply. I don't see that. That's wrong, especially when it came to Bill Gothard, and I confronted him about that too. And it just it spiraled from there. I just couldn't reconcile that in my head.
Dude, I'm so glad we talked because it's I'm so glad we are talking. Like, I'm wrapping the episode. I'm so glad we talked. Thanks for coming on. There's so much similarity in, I think, our perception and then our experience. Like, this is one of the biggest things. My dad doesn't listen to the show, so I can say this, but I have a good relationship with my dad now. But
I doesn't either. He's dead.
But I don't know what to say to that one. But thanks for dropping that bomb on me. But I really question with my dad, like, what killed that questioning mindset, and I struggled so hard. With little things, it's easy to brush off and go like, well, whatever. They didn't care about really knowing about why we use the King James or whatever those little things are. But when it came to like cover-ups and scandals, I would sit there and go like, Dad, I had a phone call with my dad, early on starting the podcast. And it was kind of things were starting to heat up between us a little bit more. And I just remember sitting there and being like, I realized this at 16. And it's crazy to me that 55+ year olds don't understand this. And it's such a heart-wrenching feeling when you see someone that you do like I looked up to my dad a lot. In many ways, I still do. There's things about him that were amazing and are amazing. But then there's this area here where it's like, what killed that questioning inside of you? What killed that spirit of rebellion inside you that is so important? And do you think for your parents, do you think it was like this sunk cost fallacy where it's like, we've put so much time into this ministry, we can't ruin it? Do you think they were drinking the Kool-Aid? Or do you think it was something where it's like what is it, do you think, that makes somebody start sacrificing their own moral principles in favor of protecting a brand that doesn't give a crap about them? Like, what do you think that is?
I think there are two things that my dad said that really kind of shed a little bit of light on that for me. One was one time, because he would always tell me things when it was just him and I, that he wouldn't say in front of mom or any of my siblings. He always had to be, the head of the house, and he always had to be the one in control and all that whenever that was happening. But between me and him, we would sometimes talk about things that he wouldn't bring up otherwise. And once he told me that he didn't really have any true friends in the ministry, that pretty much all of his preacher friends at one time or another had a disagreement with him about some very minuscule thing. Like, he had one preacher friend who almost cut off all contact with him because he refused to send him a prayer letter every month while we were on the mission field instead of bi-monthly, and which would have been a logistical nightmare for us because it was hard enough to get one done bi-monthly as it was. But this one preacher out of like the 90 churches that supported us wanted it monthly. And Dad said, I'm sorry, we just can't do that just for you. And he dropped our support and, didn't talk to us again. And that was one of my dad's oldest friends. And he said, I really don't have any friends in the ministry because, at some point, everybody has a problem or everybody has a fight. And I just think it's sad. I think that was one side of it. The other side was after I had left fundamentalism, I did go fishing with him one last time before he got too sick to do so. And we were fishing, and we weren't even talking about anything spiritual. We were just talking about fishing for the most part. And out of nowhere, he said, look, son, he said, I personally saw a lot of preachers higher up do a lot of things that frankly probably should have put them in jail. But it wasn't my place to say anything. And I told him, I said, Dad, whose place was it? There's nobody higher in the IFB than a preacher. Like, allegedly, each preacher is supposed to be the highest rank because the churches are all independent. So what's even higher than that? Where is this hierarchy coming from? Is there a denomination, an organized one, or not? I was like, if you weren't going to say anything about it, who was? He didn't have an answer for that. So I think at some point he saw some things that realized that if he said anything, he would lose whatever connections he had left. And as far as like all the years he had put into the ministry, because my dad wasn't like a rich person, he wasn't very successful in his ministry. We were missionaries to two of the most affluent Christianized countries in the world, the Netherlands and Belgium. You think they wanted Southern fundamentalism in those countries? Spoilers, they did not. So we wasted our time over there, to be perfectly frank. And he spent his last few years trying to start up a church in an abandoned coal mining town of all things in Alabama. So he never really reached these magnificent heights of IFB stardom or anything. He just, kept working at it and kept doing all the things he was prescribed and never really achieved any kind of notoriety for it. And I think that really ate at him. And I think he was just trying to hold on to whatever he had left. I think it's sad because, like you, I see my dad as a whole person. Outside of his job as a preacher, he was a person who loved things. He loved cars. He could tell you any car from like the 50s and 60s just by the sound of an engine. He actually had a little soft spot for 50s rock and roll that he tried very unsuccessfully to hide. he had stories of himself as like a kid and some of the things he got up to that were hilarious that had nothing to do with like being a preacher. But the only thing that was ever talked about at his funeral was his job as a preacher. And he had spent his whole life trying to build up that image. And at the end of the day, I think that's all he felt he had left. And that was more impetus for me to live more authentically for myself because I'm like, I don't want that for myself
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah. I appreciate you sharing all that candidly too. It is one of those things like my biggest arguments with my dad have always been related to scandals in the church. And I think he's in many ways seeing the light now. Like he went from when I started the show being, you shouldn't do this to now he will listen to the occasional episode and say, I really hope that there's changes in these areas, like lots of transitions and shifts. But it's like the story you just mentioned. It's like, it's those moments. It was never fishing for us, but to use that allegory, it's like you have these moments with your dad where you're like, we are fishing and he's talking about fishing. And I love this moment and he's amazing. And then you get into the church, and it's like literally taking their identity away from them and leaving them at the end of their life or at the end of their ministry tenure with nothing, no relationships. You leave the church, you leave your community, you lose your money, whatever little money you had, you lose your and it's heartbreaking to me to see that. And it's heartbreaking because like even telling your parents like, hey, this thing is not working. Like the immediate thought I know is going through their head is like, well, this is my last 20 years or 30 years of my life. Like, what do you mean it's nothing? It's such a heavy thing to navigate with a family member that you do care about. Like as frustrating as the relationship can be at times, it's really sad. Like, and seeing them as the whole person, it's like, man, you got chewed up and spit out by people you thought cared about you. And that's, I don't know, it's horrific to think about. I want to run this by you because I was in therapy today myself and had a breakthrough. In your life now, obviously you've got some connections even through Shiny Happy People where you've been reunited with amazing folks. Like, I mean, Lindsay is incredible. She's another person I hopped on with. I was like, I feel like we've been friends forever. I was talking about in therapy, like, and I kind of had the epiphany myself as I was talking, but I was like, I have a really strong backbone to the culture or social media, or like if 150 people are giving me crap on social media, I don't care. It doesn't bother me at all. If somebody I care about and know, like the closer they are to my inner circle, the more it affects me in a really negative way. And my therapist was saying it's usually the opposite. People care more about like the crowd and what social media thinks, and they'll be jerks to their family and they don't think twice about it. And I told her, I said, I feel like because I grew up in such a fundamentalist, tight-knit circle, I look and I've seen things happen to my dad and to other people in ministry is like, I view my close friendships as a scarce commodity. And like, if I do the wrong thing or make the wrong stance, I'm going to lose that commodity. So like, I'm always in panic mode about it. Like, what do relationships look like for you now? And like, and also another layer on top of that is like, I'm always panicking about auditing my circle and going like, am I in an echo chamber? Like, are we back in Cult 101? Like, how do you navigate having real friendships now that aren't based in shared dogma, but are based in like, hey, we're cool people that are different, but also complement each other really well?
Whew. Wow,
just an easy little,
there.
just a 5-minute question that's part
seconds,
statement, Yeah. My question will always be longer than the answer. That's what, that'll be the complaint.
Cool. No, it's fine. Those are actually some really good points. As far as like making friends with people who are outside the dogma, because one of my favorite podcasters and creators, No Illusions, brought this up one time about social circles and how churches tend to, especially, and I know this is especially true in the IFB, how churches tend to try to make all your social circle revolve around the church. And especially modern churches that have like different special interest groups and small groups. Like you can go to a bowling small group in a church. And I'm not saying that, finding your social group in something like that is necessarily wrong in and of itself, but it's a little weird that, it's based on something where, quite frankly, looking back, a lot of the people that I hung out with in the IFB, I wouldn't be friends with in real life because we had nothing else in common, you know? But I now build my friendships on things that I feel are more solid, like shared interests. I have a lot of friends in the local theater community where I am here in Birmingham, Alabama. I am involved with the local improv troupe, and through that, a lot of people in the local theater filmmaking community and stuff like that. And that's something I've always had an interest in. I'm a complete nerd, which you probably couldn't tell by looking at me, but no,
You grew up in
I'm a nerd.
IBLP. It checks out. That's like the
Yeah.
career path, you know.
You
Oh,
know what? Honestly, I think Dungeons and Dragons is, the demonic influence that got me out of IFE.
there you
No,
go.
no, but I'm a complete nerd. I go to Dragon Con and in Atlanta, which is like this big sci-fi fantasy convention. I have friends I see there every year, and I love hanging out with them. I'm friends with like the local nerd community. I have friends in like various different aspects of life, some of which cross over, some of which don't. But it's not like I'm getting it all from one source. So I feel like, and of course, there are friends who I hold closer than others. Lindsay and Heather from the documentary, for example, they have been my friends for years, even before the documentary. And we really bonded over the shared experience of doing that. Now, Tara and Floyd Oathhout as well, they've become really close. And, a lot of, like all of us who were in the documentary at some level have, interacted and like, really gotten to know each other and have really become a lot closer as a result. I got to meet Tia Levings last year, and she is just an absolutely amazing person. I know that you've experienced that as well. She
Yeah.
is just flat out like one of my idols, but one of the
It's
people
like
I want to be when I grow up.
she's like the
But
Stephen King of fundamentalist. She's such a crazy writer, dude. Like and she puts
yes.
out stuff I feel like every day, and I
Mhm.
read it and I'm like, I have to use 100% of my brain power to squeeze out my episode. I'm doing interviews, and then she's like, here's a 30 page article about this that explains it perfectly. And you're like, Tia is just she's she's a force.
Yes,
It's
and the thing
insane.
is, like, she is just like that in real life.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
from the very first moment I met her in real life and everything, like, you can tell that she lives and that she internalizes, what she preaches, and it is just absolutely amazing. Love her to death. But making friends on all these levels, and like you said, there is that fear that I often have to, and this is really translate itself in romantic relationships for me, and this is something I'm actively working on in therapy where, I feel like someone else's happiness is my responsibility, and I'm not saying that that's a excuse for me to go be a jerk and be insensitive, but there is also that pendulum swing of completely sacrificing your needs for the other person. And I am learning more and more about how to establish boundaries and how to, ask for and seek my needs and say no once in a while in order to not be that people pleaser who's constantly trying to keep someone in your life. And that has been a huge issue for me because, we all grew up, with this fear of like being churched or being ostracized or, what have you in the IFB or, being othered to the point that, and especially as a missionary kid, whenever we would visit a church, dad would give us a briefing as to what this particular church would allow and would not allow. Sometimes we weren't even allowed to talk about the fact that we were an IBLP, because some IFB churches just weren't into that. So, you had to learn to be all things to all people, and then you lose yourself. I mean, what was it we were taught in the IFB? JOY, Jesus first, others second, yourself last. And come to find out, sometimes you got to put your own oxygen mask on before you tend to others. And that has been one of the hardest things for me to learn. But I feel like year by year, especially as I get older and more settled into who I am and who I am authentically, that becomes easier to navigate, especially when I have so many people that I connect with in so many different contexts and on different levels.
And that's why I asked about childhood Chad, which is such an easy phrase to say. Childhood Chad could be a whole series on its own. But I'm really excited when I look at people that I've been following for the last couple years, like yourself, or which is crazy. It's been a couple years. Like I've been doing this for a couple years, and I'm seeing these things that pop up that are like, this is your life now. And it is so independent of that past. And like, I see people when they start talking about this and it's a flood. Like, it's like, here's all this stuff I bottled up and now I get to say it in a public way. And in many ways, your life is still built on the foundation of that. And like, it's so neat to me now. Like, I think when I run into people now, or like I'm sitting out with family, like they think I want to talk about this all day when I'm in person. But like, I have my own life and business and family and interests that are so independent of that childhood. And I think that's really cool. And that's why I was curious, like, when you look at yourself now and you wake up, it's like you get to be Chad as Chad exists. Not, oh, I'm Chad in spite of, or I'm Chad, but also I woke up just thinking about religious trauma every morning. Cause like, I don't know about you, I felt like every morning for a while, I would wake up and be like, my life sucked and I had all these things taken away and this is awkward and I feel socially uncomfortable in these situations. Like, but it's really cool to be like, the further you get away from it, like the less and less control there is over time. And I don't know, maybe I'm projecting all that because that's what I feel, but I feel like I've seen that even with you. And like, I see Lindsay, like I like seeing Lindsay post her stuff from her makeup career as much as I love seeing the cult chronicle stuff. Cause I'm like, this is you. And it's so cool that this did not die with IBLP.
Yeah, matter of fact, you bring up a good point because, I mentioned Dragon Con earlier. The first time I went to Dragon Con in Atlanta was in 2009, and I still technically was in fundamentalism at that time.
Whoa.
Yeah.
You're like walking through the door, hiding your face.
Well, I mean, this is when I was like really starting to question things, and I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I lived alone and all that. And I went on a Saturday morning and I got a day pass to go to this convention, sci-fi and fantasy. I've always had, like nerdy thing. And especially when I lived alone, I would like rent things off of Netflix back when it was a DVD service, and I would catch up on all these sci-fi and fantasy movies I had missed, growing up in the IFB and IBLP. So I was already like really getting into that. And so when I got to Dragon Con and I was standing in line for my badge at 7 a.m, there was this dude in front of me who was dressed as the mayor of Halloween Town from The Nightmare Before Christmas. And we just struck up a conversation just out of nowhere about, what all we were expecting to see and what all, we were excited about and stuff. And then out of nowhere, he was like, hey, I could do a really good Kermit the Frog imitation. You want to hear it? And he started singing Rainbow Connection completely unprompted. No context for it. But I remember in that moment thinking, this is weird. And I'm okay with that. Like, none of this, the whole context, everybody around me is dressed weird. Everybody around me is into things I never grew up with. And they're okay with it. And it's fun and it's fine. And this is normal. And I was like, this feels more like my people than at church. Because at church, you always have to put your best face forward.
Also dressed weird.
Yes, also dressed weird, but at least at Dragon Con, everybody's dressed weird by choice. At church, you have to wear your tie just right and everything. You have to be all pressed and all that. And I'm like, I think that was the first time where authenticity really sunk in with me. I was like, oh, this is what it feels like to just like something for the sake of liking it. And I've been back every year since. Like when I made my full break from fundamentalism, I got more into it, obviously. But I remember like that being the first time in my adult life where I just felt at home in a weird environment, and it was fun.
This purely selfish question: being interested in sci-fi, renting movies. I got to know, like, what are some of the movies you watched coming out of fundamentalism that you were like, I've been missing out on this forever?
Oh my God. Okay. So, I actually, before we got really into IBLP, I had seen a couple of episodes of Mystery Science Theater 3000. Like way, way back in the day, my older sister used to record some of the older ones on TV and stuff. And I thought they were hilarious. And I didn't get half the jokes. I was like 5 or 6. And growing up, I had access to like getting those DVDs and watching those really cheesy old B movies. I love that. Me and one of my friends in the IFB who was cool. You always found those people who, would at least break some of the rules as long as we all mutually agreed not to tell on each other. we actually watched what we thought was like this little B sci-fi movie because we like bad movies. And we got this little movie called Serenity, which we watched, and I loved it. I was like, oh, this is really good. Wait, there was a TV show that went with this. So I watched Firefly after I watched Serenity, which I don't know if I'm sure a lot of people listening right now, if you're not familiar, Eric, a lot of people listening are just like, that's not how you're supposed to do it. It's fine. It's fine. I still enjoyed all of it to the fullest. But yeah, I saw things like that, and of course, my older brother was really into Star Wars, and because he was the golden child, he was allowed to have that. But we had to fast forward through any scenes that involved the Force. So Star Wars was like 30 minutes in my world. So I finally got to watch,
I thought you
all
were
the
going to say
Force
the
scenes
gold
and everything.
bikini scene, but yeah, the Force, that makes sense too.
Well, that too, but yeah, like so I got to see Star Wars in its fullness. I'm like, oh, okay, well, it makes more sense now. And just things like that, like things that people grew up with, and things that are part of the whole cultural zeitgeist. I spent a lot of time catching up on that stuff, and probably way more than most of my peers, to be honest. But yeah, like it helped me regain that sense of wonder that I always had. And just the narratives and the stories and the imagination that goes into all that just really appealed to me, especially as a nerd that was suppressed for so long.
Right. Yeah. I had to ask because, like, for me, that was lucky. That was one of the things my parents were very lenient on because my mom was obsessed with literature. So, like, she would just be like, "We're gonna talk about it, though," after, and it's like, "Okay, yeah, we'll watch this." And there's still movies I couldn't watch because they were R or whatever. So, like, I caught The Matrix like 2 years ago for the first time. Like, but it is such a I feel like I've had the most like spiritually enlightening moments in my life in theaters and watching movies where it's like you see a story presented in a way, which it makes sense. Jesus used parables for the same reason, but it's like, oh, these things are clicking for me. This political perspective clicks for me. The empathy you gain for different perspectives watching movies is so cool. And there's just so much good stuff out there that's like you were not allowed to watch. Um, I got to ask you one last selfish question on this. Are you a Star Wars guy or a Star Trek guy?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
I will say on the
good
whole,
answer.
I probably watch more Star Wars. I actually at one point tried to watch all the Star Trek episodes in order of air date.
Tough.
And yeah, it's tough, especially when you get to season 1 of Next Gen. I'm like, really, guys? But it gets better, I know. But but like, I love it all, really. I
Yeah.
mean, I love them each for what they bring to the table. Star Wars being like the, little homage to especially, the original trilogy, the homage to all the old B sci-fi movies and everything, which I love anyway. And Star Trek with this, philosophical, like almost utopian view of the future, along with all the, imaginative aliens and stuff like that. It's a lot of fun, and human beings, one of the things I'm dead set on is that human beings always seek narrative in everything and try to make sense of the world through a story. Now, the world itself, I believe, is chaotic, and the universe itself is chaotic, and the only narrative and the only sense we make of it is what we put into it and what we gain out of it. But the fact that we're able to think that abstractly and actually find patterns and find things that work through story and through narrative and through sparking that imagination fascinates me. Someone once says science fiction becomes science fact because it inspires that kind of thinking. And I'm very much a believer in that. And I am very I can see the power now of what these abstract thoughts and these abstract stories have that they were trying to shield us from, because it doesn't really lend itself well to having automatons saying yes sir and yes ma'am when you have this broad imaginative landscape of story.
Right.
Sorry, I think I just went way off into the
No,
weird, but that's cool.
I could go so deep into the weird. And you
Yeah.
need to, if you like B movies, which you do, and if you like Star Wars, which you do, you need to watch, if you haven't seen it, the I think it's like 1978 movie Star Crash.
Yes,
You've seen it?
that was with Marjo Gortner, right?
Let me double check. It's with it's Luigi. I know Luigi Cosi directed it, but it was let me look. David Hasselhoff's in it. And yes, you are correct. Yeah, you've seen it. Like Christopher Plummer should not be there, but he
Yep.
is. So
Christopher Plummer was there on vacation.
he's like,
By the
paycheck.
way, you know the story behind Marjoe Gortner, don't you?
No.
Oh, you need to look into that. I think it'd
Okay.
be right up your alley.
I'm gonna deep
Marjoe
dive.
was yeah, he was the subject of a 1971 documentary called Marjoe. His name is a pastiche of Mary and Joseph. He was a charismatic circuit preacher who made a documentary in 1971
The
exposing
youngest
all the
ordained
secrets of how he
minister.
did what. Yes, he was. He was basically like this little 5-year-old, money machine for his parents, doing all these little preaching stunts. And then when he became an adult, he brought a documentary crew with him to expose all the secrets of what he was doing in his revivals. It's actually really fascinating. It won an Academy Award for Best Documentary that year.
Wow. His name's not even one that's in my internal glossary, but now it will be. And again, this is why you're here. Like, see, but this is the stuff though that I geek out on, where I'm like, let me look into every cast member and go deep down. Like all the Italian giallo films. Like I'm like, all these people are in James Bond movies. Like I could see all the times they filmed James Bond movies in France, and then you're like seeing all the connections over. But anyway, nobody listening is like, yes, more Star Crash and James Bond conversation. If you are, drop a comment below, and I'm happy to keep that going. Is there anything? Last movie question: is there anything that is like culturally super relevant you haven't seen yet from your past that you're like, I've got to check it off? Like The Matrix for me was that forever. Is there one that you're like, I got to cross this one off? I'm embarrassed to say I haven't seen it.
I will say, speaking of Star Trek, I haven't seen all the classic Star Trek movies yet.
Oh, you got
I
it.
know. I kind of hopped on board with the Kelvin timeline, and
Those are great. Yeah.
yeah. Oh, love them. But I really want to go back and like watch all the original ones. I've seen enough clips to get like what they're all about. But I feel like, as a matter of fact, one of the quotes from which one was it?
I think I know what you're going to say. Or what would God
What
need
does
with the
God need with a
starship?
spaceship, basically?
Yeah.
What does God need with a starship, rather? Yeah. That one of those quotes is actually one of my favorite quotes when it comes to deconstruction and everything, because that was something I asked myself quite often. I'm like, what does God need with a starship?
Yeah.
Why is it important that we go to the Netherlands and Belgium and stuff? But yeah,
that movie, I think that's Undiscovered Country, if I'm remembering right. But it's the movie itself is probably one of the weakest of the original. But it was like, I was kind of watching like, okay, perfunctory viewing of this. And then Shatner drops that, like, what does God need with a starship? And you're like, oh my God, that's like one of the best lines ever written in one of the worst Star Trek movies ever made. And it's so good. But yeah, it is a great, but again, that's the beauty of art, is like that one line makes you go like, yeah, what does he need all this for? What's the point of this? But anyway, so theology and Star Trek, we'll do a separate episode at some point, diving into
I'm in. Let's do it. You can do a podcast on that.
Right. Yeah, you could. Do you follow the TikTok account, God Awful Movies? He kind of does like the Mystery Science Theater treatment to evangelical movies. It's
absolutely.
So
as a matter of fact, I'm hoping to go to their live show in Nashville coming up. So
very cool.
That's the whole thing. Yeah.
Very cool. Well, for everybody still listening, I'm so sorry. Thank you for allowing me to just rant about movies for a second. I do have some questions from the group. I want to ask you, kind of rapid fire. Somebody says, "Do you still believe in the gospel, or do your experiences make you want to have nothing to do with Christianity?" I think people can probably infer some from what you've said, but I'll kind of phrase it broader. Like, what does spirituality mean to you now versus what it used to mean?
Sure. Spirituality to me, I don't really use the term spiritual. And to answer directly that question, no, I am an atheist, and I'm very proud of that. And
Next.
yeah, exactly. But when it comes to like, I interpret spirituality to mean a sense of awe or a sense of wonder. And I feel like there's plenty of that, even if you don't believe in the supernatural. One of my favorite things to tell people, and if you've seen me on TikTok, you've heard me say this numerous times, but right now, up in space, we got a bunch of rocks that we dug out of the ground here. We tricked him into doing math. We shot him into space. We're taking pictures of stuff that happened billions of years ago. We're beaming it down with invisible waves, and we're putting them online on this website, web.nasa.gov. You can go see these like really cool images of space that we have up to this point never been able to see before. We've seen further than the human eye has ever even thought about seeing in spectrums we can't even envision. And we did all that with stuff that works. And I feel like the amount of things that we still have to discover and the things that we can continue developing as a species, because we are good at working together and we can, make these things happen through trial and error and learning more and more about the universe we're in. I think that is cause for awe. And for more information on that, I recommend to everyone reading The Demon Haunted World by Carl Sagan, life-changing book. And I feel like that is a good place to start on how to have awe, even if you don't believe in the spiritual realm.
Love it. Someone says, what advice would you give to a fundamentalist who may be interested in leaving the denomination? Do it.
Ooh, yeah. First of all, I always tell people, do it in as much as it is safe for you to do so. If there is a reason for you, if your immediate safety is threatened by you leaving, only you know your situation, but don't put yourself at unnecessary risk in leaving. Mm-hmm. But do understand that if you are thinking of leaving, please find the best resources you can to support you. And they are out there. I believe 100% what Tia said in Shiny Happy People. When you're out there flopping around like a little fish, the universe and people who are out there to help, they catch you. There are people willing to help. And that little voice in your head that says something is wrong, like I said in the docuseries, that's right. That's not a demon. That's not Satan encouraging doubt. That's you. That's your intuition saying, I need help. And do seek that. I definitely encourage that.
Yeah. What kind of therapy did he get after he left religiosity? I love that word, religiosity.
That's a really good question. I started out with a lot of cognitive behavior therapy, a lot of CBT, a lot of like just sharing my story, and a lot of role playing, a lot of and I've done a little bit of EMDR. Things really got a lot better when I started taking medication. I am taking Zoloft at this point myself, and I'm okay sharing that with folks because I think it should be destigmatized. And like, if you have a broken leg, you need to go see a doctor about it. And if things are imbalanced in your mind and your brain through trauma and what have you, it's good to seek, actual therapy and, medical assistance for it. There's nothing wrong with it. It doesn't mean that you're a bad person for doing so. It just simply means you need help, and that's some form of help. And everyone's different, find what works for you and definitely pursue that.
Yeah. Love that. Okay. This one is my favorite question. It's in the private group, so I won't say their name, but you know who you are. And this is a question I wish I would have thought of. Was there anything discussed in the interviews that you wish were included in Shiny Happy People? And I know from Let Us Pray, you sit there for hours and then you're like, they didn't use that one quote that I was so proud of. What was that for you?
I'll be honest, it was a 5-hour interview. The main stuff that you see in Shiny Happy People, that was 5 hours in Savannah, Georgia. I drove down there. It was a whole thing. Yeah, that they used probably the cleanest things I said. I kind of wish they had left in some of my cussing, because I turned the air blue when I was talking. And at one point I kind of felt the old Baptist preacher gene in me rising, and I was actually pointing at the camera yelling. I was like, whoa, back it up, man.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I wish they had included some of that, because, and this is something that Lizzie and I have talked about. She's like, why am I the only person in there that swears? I'm like, I don't know. I tried. But we did talk a little bit about
Sam Kinison, like just the preacher, but as vulgar as you can be.
Oh yeah. So sometimes, when I get really head up about this stuff, like, I tell people, careful, the preacher's coming out. So, it's kind of like a Hulk thing. But no, we did talk a little bit about the influence that may be connected with certain things in Russia, because at one point IBLP really made inroads in Russia after the wall fell. You can actually see it's on YouTube somewhere. It's called The Russian Story from ATI, and you can actually watch like some of the things they had there. I feel like there may have been some inroads established at that point. I don't have a lot of information on it, but I feel like there may have been inroads that probably started tipping off. Some people like, hey, this is something we can exploit here in the States. And well, we can see where all that's led to.
Yeah.
So, it's really interesting because I feel like that was one of the first real forays into, establishing that connection between American Thunder, the Russian people. At one point, Gothard tried, his stated goal was to try to take over all the orphanages in Russia. It did not work, spoiler, but, he was certainly ambitious in trying to do so.
Yeah. 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 That would have definitely been interesting. I also think, too, I was talking to Sabrina, I just had on the show recently about the Triple T industry. And we were kind of talking about like there's layers that sound so conspiracy theory until you start digging in. And like some of those threads, like I'm kind of glad like Shanghai Happy people didn't go down that route too much, because I think for some people they've been like, oh, it's pursuing this whole other political angle, which again, it is there for a reason. But I think it's good. Like Shiny Happy People for me is such a good overview of like, let's catch up to speed on this. And I think I would love to see a season 2, wink, wink to Amazon. I would love to see a season 2. I like how I look past my computer, like there's an Amazon exec in front of me, like getting me coffee.
There's a device listening behind me. It's fine.
Hey, Alexa, season 2. But I would love to see a season 2 that dives into some of those deeper things and allows it to go another layer deeper. I blacked out during my interview. I do remember one phrase that I said that I'm so mad isn't in there. And I said Jack Hyles was not the official founder of the IFB, but he was basically the Walt Disney of the IFB. He turned it into a brand. And I love that example so much. And that was the only thing I really remembered saying. The rest of it was all new to me when I watched it. I was like, I said that. I don't know when I said that, but yeah, there's
maybe you
always
should have said
those
Michael
things.
Eisner. I don't know.
maybe, yeah. What's the guy now that runs it? Bob
Rob Iger.
Yeah. But anyway, there's always things that like carry room for. So I'm glad someone asked that question. I got to ask. It's a perfunctory question. Everybody's going to ask anyway. They're going to say, "Why didn't you talk about it?" Is there a season 2 coming anytime soon? I know nobody asked you that on any podcast you go on.
My understanding is that there very well could be, but as far as like my involvement and everything, I don't have any information on that.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, there you go. Just so people don't bother later and say, hey,
Yeah.
why didn't you ask? Well, cool. I mean, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I don't feel like it's going to be our last discussion, and I'm sorry it took so long for this to happen. Is there anything that you want to add or anything that we didn't talk about that you want to make sure you just like mic drop this moment? People need to know this thing before we hit the stop record button.
There is one thing that I want to tie into the question about my personal beliefs now and the whole the aftermath of Shiny Happy People. One thing that I have noticed from folks, and I do want to put this out there, that has been a little concerning, is that I have actually had people approach me about my own lack of faith and everything from after seeing Shiny Happy People and being concerned about my story. And I have actually been approached about this on the street as well. Like,
wow.
Some folks recognize me, and then they started saying like, "Oh, but well, we're so sad to hear that you left the church and everything." I'm like, look, if you saw Shiny Happy People and your takeaway was that I'm the problem, you missed the point. I said, if nothing, like as far as me, I'm fine. I'm taking care of myself and everything, and I'm following my own path and all that, and I am well and truly clear of the cult. So I'm never going back to that. And don't worry, I'm okay on that point. I'm safe. But there are people who are not. And if you are a believer, if you're someone who is involved in the church, I would encourage you, if you're tempted to think, well, maybe I should reach out to him, don't. I'm okay. The people you need to be reaching out to are the IBLP. You need to let them know that this is not welcome in your circles. And I actually want to call upon Christians and everything, because I'm not mad at you and I'm not against you in general. But I would like you to please take more action against the bad actors in your midst. there are people who are using their positions in churches of all stripes, but especially in fundamentalism, inherently in fundamentalism, to exploit people, to harm people, and to build empires like what you saw in IBLP based on the backs of people who pay the price for it, people who are vulnerable. That is the stuff you really need to focus in on. If you do that, I will be so happy. And I hope that you take that to heart for what it is. This is in your house. Please clean it up. I'm doing everything I can for my end. We need you as well.
Yeah. We almost got Preacher Chad in there. I almost saw it happen. I almost saw it, but no, I love that. I'm glad you brought that up, and I love that you mentioned that about the takeaways. Like, and I would say the same for this episode. Like, I feel like I've been a little bit more unbuttoned in the last few episodes, dangerously walking on thin ice with some people that want these conversations to be had a certain way. But, again, I had somebody on who's been severely abused by multiple pastors and people in the church. And for them, they said they don't even like saying the word God. Like, it's so and people are so mad at that. And I'm like, what about like the rapist pastors that you like that watch the takeaway? And again, for people who listen and go, I don't like when this guest cussed, or when you guys talked about this thing, or why do you have atheists on, or why do you have Christians that aren't my stripe? You're taking the wrong thing away from the episode. So that's all I'm going to say on that. You said it already so perfectly, so I'm not gonna recap it all in my own voice.
Please
in
do.
a less perfect way. But yeah, it's so frustrating to me when I see that stuff where it's like someone said the F word. It's like someone literally is molesting kids in this church. Like, whine to me about something else, like besides this. But anyway, that's all I'm gonna say on that. On that very happy, exciting note, Chad, thank you so much for doing this. And sincerely, this episode means a lot to me. So much of what you said, especially early on in the conversation, really hit home in a very real way. And thank you. It meant a lot to me. And like I said, I hope this isn't our last. Maybe we'll do like a purely fun episode here in the future. I think it'd be a good time.
I'd love that. And Eric, I got to say, this is one of the best interviews I've done. I really do appreciate your very thoughtful questions. You have absolutely, blown my mind with some of them. And yeah, this has been well worth the wait. And I enjoy to talk to you, and I hope we do it again.